Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. Just a quick reminder that you can support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up either A Popular History of Unpopular Things or APHOUT, A-P-H-O-U-T. And you can also now watch episodes on YouTube, so go subscribe to my channel there. I appreciate all of the love and support. So, for those of you who might have listened to a bunch of my episodes by now, or know me personally, you know that I am super into serial killers. Always have been. I'm a true crime girly through and through, and there's a whole lot of us out there, by the way, so don't judge me. And growing up, I studied and read about all kinds of serial killers, not just the ones that are household names like Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, but also guys like Richard Ramirez, who was the Night Stalker in LA, or Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. How about the Sons of Sam, the Green River Killer, Zodiac? There's, unfortunately, an endless list of these guys. And those are just the American famous ones, by the way. Who can forget about Harold Shipman, a British doctor that ended up killing potentially upwards of 250 people? Or Fred and Rose West, a couple who killed together in the UK. Or Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, who did the same thing but up in Canada. Or just female serial killers in general, who worked alone, like Eileen Wuornos. There are just so many stories, and I used to stay up late reading in my bed, reading about them on the Crime Library website, which is now gone, but can be accessed using the internet's Wayback Machine. I think I've mentioned that before. I don't remember which episode. It was probably Holmes or Jack the Ripper. Anyway, man, I was a really, really messed up kid. This podcast is teaching me a lot about myself. Who needs therapy, eh? Anyway, there is a whole subset of killers that most would consider more historic, and those fascinate me too. I already did back-to-back episodes on some of them. We have H.H. Holmes, who in my episode I posited was not a serial killer, just a regular killer, a fraudster, a liar, a mass murderer. And then I did one on Jack the Ripper, who was definitely a serial killer, though we don't really know with certainty who he actually was. It's been one of the longest enduring true crime mysteries, right? And then that got me thinking about historic killers in general, and I thought about good old Lizzie Borden. Maybe you've heard the rhyme associated with her. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks, and when she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Lizzie Borden was not actually a serial killer, but she certainly fits nicely into that killers from history category. She was accused, arrested, and put on trial for murdering her father and stepmother in Fall River, Massachusetts in the summer of 1892. But she was acquitted. So today, I want to explore that story. I'll start with the briefest of historical contexts. What was happening in Massachusetts in and around 1892? What was the US like? What was the world like? Who was Lizzie Borden? Okay. And then we'll take a look at the bloody, bloody murder scene and try to understand why Lizzie was acquitted. And I'm going to make an argument that Lizzie Borden and her story is the perfect metaphor for America in the late 19th century. That's the 1800s. So let's get started. 1892 in America fits squarely into what we call the Gilded Age. Fun fact, the Gilded Age actually comes from Mark Twain, who wrote a book of the same name. It's a play on the idea of a golden age, right? To gild something, G-I-L-D, to gild something is to coat it with a thin layer of gold to make it look fancy and rich, but in reality, it's not. Like cheap gold earrings that are called gold-plated. If you ever wondered, gold-plated earrings, it's not gold, it's just a thin covering, a thin layer of gold on top of a cheaper metal to make it look fancier. In reality, the metal below the gilding, okay, the gold layer, is usually copper or brass or sometimes sterling silver, but it's a cheaper metal. So the Gilded Age is just that. It's a thin layer of gold, so to speak, to make it look fancier than it actually is. It's a great metaphor and image for this period in America, roughly the 1870s to the late 1890s. It's after the Reconstruction era, which was rebuilding the country after the Civil War, and before the Progressive era, where activism led to social and political reforms. The Gilded Age was all about industrialization and economic growth, but this was only a gilded facade. Everything looked great and golden and rich and generally better than what came before. Look at these new railroads. Neat. Look at all this industry. Cool. America is recovering. Jobs are everywhere. Cities are growing. But under that thinly gilded surface, there was still immense poverty. Workers were exploited, both in the working conditions and in the pay they were given. There was a general fear and dislike of immigrants, and more generically, anyone who wasn't white and Protestant, and the gap between the rich and the poor was more noticeable and growing. The Gilded Age is before the time when we start seeing people fighting back against this corruption and the horrible working conditions. Think Upton Sinclair and his book, The Jungle. Not about trees, for those of you who haven't heard of it. It was a takedown of the Chicago meat packing plants, which were corrupt, unsanitary, blood-spattered industries. Quite literally, blood and rotten meat all over the factory floor. You can only imagine how disgusting that smelled. And then we've got the rise of women's suffrage movements and organizations built to help immigrants settle and adapt to life in the United States. But all of that, or at least most of that, was in the Progressive era, in the 1900s. The Gilded Age had all of this corruption too, but it mostly went unchallenged. And out of that gilded progress, the illusion that life was great and awesome and things were improving for everyone, we actually get a handful of historic killers taking advantage of all the chaos. Perhaps the most well-known was H.H. Holmes, who operated throughout the 1890s, killing men and women who got in his way of running scams, basically, on the residents of Chicago. I did an episode on him where I argued that he actually wasn't a serial killer based off of the definition of what a serial killer is. He was just a mass murderer, a scam artist, and a compulsive liar. And then we have Lizzie Borden, the daughter of a relatively well-off businessman who was accused of hatcheting her father and stepmother to death in 1892. And this case, this family, is the perfect representation of the Gilded Age itself. From the outside, everything seems golden, but just underneath that thin gilding of wealth was a broken, dysfunctional family. So let's crack on with it. Who were the Bordens? Now, living at the Borden family home on 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts, were 5 people. Andrew Borden, the father, was a successful businessman, and at the time of his murder, he was 69 years old. He was notoriously tight with his money and would scrutinize his expenses, so much so that he gave his 2 adult daughters, both unmarried and still living in the family home, a weekly allowance that was less than they could get working. Also at the home was his second wife, Abby Borden. She was the stepmother brought in after Andrew's first wife died, and at the time of the murder, she was 62. By most accounts, she was a nice woman, but her 2 stepdaughters, who also lived at the home, hated her. The older daughter was Emma, 41. The younger daughter, Lizzie, 32. Andrew didn't have any other living children, and like I mentioned, both daughters were unmarried. They would have been called spinsters, unmarried women who were older than the typical marriage age, which in the Gilded Age, this period of time, was around 18 to 20. Spinsters also typically didn't have any plans to get married, but I think the girls were okay with that. Because their father was wealthy, they considered themselves as high society girls, women of leisure. They didn't work. They lived in the family home and did whatever they want. But because of their father's frugalness, they didn't actually live a high society life, or at least not the one that they wanted. More on that in a sec. The last permanent member of the Borden household was their Irish servant, 26-year-old Bridget Sullivan. It was common for Irish women in the mid to late 19th century to take up domestic servant jobs. For a more in-depth explanation of how Irish immigrants came to the US, go listen to my episode on the Irish potato famine. But as an immigrant woman, Bridget was seen as lesser by her, or at least lesser than her employers, Andrew, Emma, Lizzie, and Abby. Now, Andrew, Emma, and Lizzie called her Maggie, which was the name of their previous Irish servant. They couldn't even be bothered to learn her name. Abby knew it, though, and called her Bridget, which was great and normal and what you should be doing. Abby wasn't part of this old money social elite that ran Fall River, and that's the difference. The Bordens, you see, were one of the wealthy families who populated Fall River in its early days. They were white and Protestant and went back several generations. They owned big chunks of industry there as well, as did their previous family. And they considered themselves Yankees, native-born inhabitants of New England. As Kara Robertson writes in her book, The Trial of Lizzie Borden, quote, "The elite derive their status from their Yankee heritage, their Congregationalism or other Protestantism, and their ownership of the mills. Through marriages and business arrangements, the leading families of Fall River preserved their control and cemented their status. That status, in turn, contributed to a self-regarding provincialism that proved difficult to dislodge." End quote. And though Andrew Borden and his family were part of the elites, they lived in a modest, single-family home on 2nd Street in Fall River, in the middle of town. It wasn't where most wealthy Fall River inhabitants and families lived. That was a place called The Hill, and both Emma and Lizzie resented the fact that they didn't live there, but their cousins did, the other side of the Borden family. From what I read, they sounded kind of bratty, to be honest. They grew up in an elite, wealthy, privileged family, but were mad that their dad didn't spoil them with the same privileges afforded to their cousins, like living on the posh side of town. But they didn't have to work, and they did whatever they wanted, more or less. It probably didn't help that of all the Bordens in Fall River, their line of Bordens were considered lesser within the family. Their line had inherited less wealth a few generations back, but although Andrew didn't inherit the bulk of his wealth like his cousins did, he became rich because he was a self-made businessman. It's probably why he scrutinized money so much more and why he was comfortable in the small middle-class home compared to the hill where the rich and fancy lived. So here's an example of that brattiness that we see with Emma and Lizzie, just to put the family dynamics into perspective for you. Andrew once purchased a house and put it in his wife, Abby's name, and allowed his wife's sister and husband to live there rent-free. Nice guy, right? Now the daughters, Emma and Lizzie, were angry that they didn't get a house in their name. They weren't angry before, they were only angry once Abby got one. They felt entitled to it and that Abby shouldn't have one. And when Andrew gave them some properties in their name of a similar size and price to try to make them happy again, they weren't satisfied with that either. The girls already didn't like their stepmother, pretty much just because she wasn't their birth mother, but this housing situation made it worse. The girls resented being in her presence so much that they started refusing to eat dinner with their father and stepmother, making their poor servant Bridget serve them separately at each meal. And I will remind you that they were adults at the time, not teenagers, as this behavior suggests. Now, Lizzie, over time, only grew more resentful. At one point, a store clerk, March 1892, the same year as the murders, referred to Abby as Lizzie's mother accidentally. And in response, Lizzie is quoted as saying, quote, "Don't say that to me, for she is a mean, good-for-nothing thing," end quote. So, in short, Lizzie hated her stepmother and was growing more resentful of her father for being, as she perceived it, cheap, and for being married to Abby. So in June 1891, a year and 2 months before the murder, there was a robbery at the Borden house. Abby's jewelry drawer was raided, and some money, gold, and other valuables were taken from Andrew's desk. Both Emma and Lizzie were apparently at home while this robbery took place and told police that they didn't hear anything, which is suspicious to say the least. But Andrew didn't want to pursue it further. Instead, he started locking everything up. Interior doors, like the ones to his office and the bedrooms, were kept locked at all times and were only unlocked when someone needed to use the room. The front door had 3 locks on it, so everything was kept under lock and key. That comes into play later. So let's fast forward a bit. 2 days before the murders, August 2nd, 1892, the whole family, except Lizzie, got sick from eating leftover fish. Emma, the older daughter, wasn't there. She was staying with a friend 30 miles or so away. Now, getting sick off fish was common enough. It's leftover fish. It's the summer. It probably went off, right? No big deal. Abby went to go talk to their doctor who lived down the road because she actually suspected that she was poisoned intentionally, which is interesting. Andrew, not wanting to spend money on a doctor, shooed him away. The next night, the whole family, except Lizzie, got sick again, this time off mutton stew. Mutton is the meat from an older sheep, lamb comes from a younger sheep. But how suspicious that the whole family gets sick again with a different meal, except Lizzie. That same night, which was the night before the murders, by the way, Lizzie called a friend and confided that she thought maybe some unnamed men had it out for her businessman father and tried to poison them. Lizzie said to her friend, quote, "I feel as if something was hanging over me that I cannot throw off, and it comes over me at times, no matter where I am." End quote. So, like a dark cloud covering her thoughts, huh? The next morning, August 4th, a neighbor saw Lizzie standing just inside the screen door of her home, which was uncharacteristically open and unlocked. Concerned, she called out to Lizzie and asked what was wrong, and Lizzie replied, "Do come over. Someone has killed Father." When police arrived at the scene, they found Andrew's body on the couch in the living room. His legs were hanging off the couch, his shoes touching the ground like he had just sat down, but his upper body was laying on the couch, one arm folded over his chest and the other at his side. The cause of death was obvious: several hatchet wounds to the head. Relatively recently, too, because there was fresh blood still running from his face. It hadn't coagulated yet, which usually happens soon after death. One witness describes his face as, quote, "a mass of raw meat." But other than the bloody victim on the couch, nothing in the house was disturbed. It didn't look like a robbery gone wrong or something like that. The doors weren't broken in, they were still locked. Things were not in disarray. Valuables weren't missing. The place was not ransacked. And apparently, during both of these murders, Lizzie and Bridget were home, and they didn't hear anything suspicious. Now, police didn't know that Abby was also dead when they arrived on scene. Lizzie had told them that Abby got a note from a friend and went out to see her. It was the Borden family servant, Bridget, who ended up finding her upstairs on the floor of the guest bedroom, face down, almost as if she was in the child's pose yoga position. Imagine kneeling on the floor and then bringing your upper body down and your arms down so that they're resting on the ground. She looked a bit like that. Her blood was darker and coagulated, meaning she was killed first. She was hit 19 times with the hatchet, and according to the police, the force of the attack was powerful enough to shatter her skull and separate a flap of skin from her back. Yikes. They estimated that she was killed sometime around 9:30 in the morning when Andrew had left the house on business, and the only other people home were Bridget and Lizzie. At 10:45, so a little more than an hour later, Andrew returns home, spoke to his daughter Lizzie, and then settled on the sofa for a quick nap. And sometime between 10:45 when he came home and 11:45, he was hit 10 times with the hatchet and died where he slept. And I will remind you that he took the hatchet to the face. Ugh. The news spread pretty rapidly, and people were justifiably terrified. One newspaper even speculated that Jack the Ripper might have come over from Britain. It was the same basic period of time, I suppose. Jack the Ripper did his killings in 1888, which is only 4 years prior to the Borden murders, so it was still fresh on everyone's minds. But no, this one seemed more personal. It wasn't a random attack. It wasn't a burglary. Somebody had targeted Andrew and Abby intentionally. I mean, getting, he had 10 hatchet marks to the face? I mean, if you're just trying to kill someone, you hit him once, right? 10 suggests anger, emotion. It was an intentional attack on him and who he was and what he stood for. Same thing with Abby. Now, there were a lot of questions and concerns about who could be responsible. How did the killer get inside when the Borden house was triple locked from the outside? How did the killer, assuming it was someone from the outside the home, not get Lizzie or Bridget's attention? I mean, I can imagine that hatcheting Abby in the upstairs guest bedroom would have been a pretty loud affair, right? Like, I can imagine she was screaming bloody murder, literally. So, how did Lizzie or Bridget not hear this? And how did they not see the killer in the hours between Abby and Andrew's death? How did the girls not hear when Andrew was killed? Lizzie spoke with him right before he died, so it's not like she didn't know he had come home. And he's in the main room of the house. That would have been heard everywhere. So things were looking more and more likely that someone inside the home had killed Andrew and Abby. And since older daughter Emma was away at a friend's with an airtight alibi and it was confirmed, it was becoming more and more likely that it was either Bridget the servant or Lizzie the daughter. And it didn't take police long to hone in on Lizzie because her story and version of events were full of holes. That note that she claimed her stepmother received, thinking that she had left the house, they never found one. And the person she was supposed to go see had no idea. And the whole story in general couldn't be corroborated. Where was Lizzie around the time her father was hatcheted to death on the couch? Apparently, according to Lizzie, she was in the loft in the barn out back. But please tell me, what does a wannabe high society spinster find interesting in a barn loft? She's not likely to be the kind of girl who does farm labor, now is she? Also, she kept changing the details of her story, so we can't really believe what she said. Now, here's what one policeman recounts from the crime scene, quote, Lizzie stood by the foot of the bed and talked in the most calm and collected manner. Her whole bearing was most remarkable under the circumstances. There was not the least indication of agitation, no sign of sorrow or grief, no lamentation of heart, no comment on the horror of the crime, and no expression of a wish that the criminal be caught. All this, and something that to me is indescribable, gave birth to a thought that was most revolting. I thought, at least, she knew more than she wished to tell. End quote. Now, when police and the district attorney later interviewed Bridget, both in private and in court, she was straightforward and cooperative. Bridget's story was that she cleaned up after breakfast, washed the windows, talked to the neighbor's housemaid for a bit, and then came back and had a quick nap inside. She didn't work 24/7. She had periods where she was allowed to do what she wanted to do. She was then woken up by Lizzie, who told her that Andrew was dead. Bridget then went to get the family doctor, and crucially, she couldn't give police any information about where Lizzie Borden was that morning or what she had been doing. And it's likely that she was out of the house talking to the housemaid across the street when Abby was killed, which is why she didn't hear anything. Lizzie Borden's questioning was next. She was a crucial witness because she was the only other person, well, living person, who was home at the time of the murders, but she was also now the main suspect. Unlike Bridget, Lizzie dodged some questions and answered others pretty vaguely. She claimed she never really saw her stepmother that morning, even though she said that she gave her a note and she left the house, right? So story full of holes. Her account on her whereabouts on the day of the murder also didn't make sense, and her undoing was the system of locks that Andrew had set up in the wake of that robbery. To get the key to the upstairs guest bedroom, which is where Abby was found dead, Abby would have had to come downstairs in view of where Lizzie said she was on the morning of the murders. When pressed, Lizzie even contradicted herself a few times on where she was in the house. Like the Gilded Age itself, that thin layer of gold was starting to show its cracks. Lizzie's story was breaking apart. She was arrested. But in 1892 New England, it was practically unfathomable that a socialite woman, and a Yankee at that, could be capable of committing what many assumed to be a man's crime because of how gruesome it was. She was a Christian. She taught kids in Sunday school. She was upper class and rich and white. And she had a lot of supporters who raised quite a fuss in her defense. And that, if we take a step back, is indicative of the times, the Gilded Age itself. Those on top were the white Protestant rich upper class. Everyone else, the immigrants, including Irish Catholics, didn't experience the same lifestyle or have the same privileges that Lizzie Borden did. They were discriminated against. They had fewer opportunities. It's nativism. which is protecting the interests of the native born over the immigrants, and it was rampant. And don't even get me started on that, by the way, because everyone in this country who is not an indigenous American can trace their roots to an immigrant at one time or another. Maybe it was last year, maybe it's you, maybe it was 10 generations ago, but we all can, right? Now, here's a good example of nativism in Fall River, and more specifically within the Borden household. There was a doctor who lived next door to the Bordens, a Dr. Kelly. But because he was an Irish Catholic, the Bordens didn't use him. They chose to go farther down the street to use a quote-unquote Yankee doctor, a white Protestant man who ran in their social circles. Even the fact that most of the Borden family didn't give their Irish servant the time of day, or could even be bothered to learn her name, gives us a good understanding of the common issues of nativism and discrimination in that community. And this came into play during the trial, because although the evidence seemed to suggest that Lizzie did the murders, part of the reason she was acquitted was because she was a woman and came from a well-to-do family. It also didn't help that Lizzie was not found with a ton of blood on her clothes, even though she admitted to changing her clothes that day, and they couldn't conclusively prove that the hatchet or the axe that was found in the family basement were the murder weapons. In an age before fingerprint analysis, let alone DNA evidence, these were key aspects of a murder investigation. But there were other things that pointed towards Lizzie as the perpetrator, other than the fact that the house was locked up and she was the only one inside. For example, she attempted to buy prussic acid at a drugstore the day before the murders. Prussic acid, also known as hydrogen cyanide, is a colorless and poisonous acid. And in certain doses, I think it's 200 to 300 parts per million, in the air, it could be fatal to humans after like a minute of exposure, I think. Now, she's a woman of leisure, right? A spinster living at home. She gets money by her father. She lives a relatively good life. What in the world does she need acid for? The pharmacist at the drugstore refused to sell to her, by the way. Maybe that's why she chose the hatchet instead. And it didn't help things with her trial, all of that. It didn't help that while she was in jail awaiting her trial, there was another axe murder that was similar to the Borden murders. On May 30th, 1893, so 9 months after the Borden ones, 22-year-old Bertha Manchester was attacked 23 times in the back and in the back of the head with an axe. The press labeled it, and the whoever ended up being, Jack the Chopper, right? Which is, of course, a reference to Jack the Ripper, a man who infamously went around attacking women in London's East End for a brief stint of time in 1888. A Portuguese farmhand named Jose Correa de Mello was arrested and charged. He wasn't even in the US, though, at the time of the Borden murders, so he couldn't be connected to those, but people were definitely more satisfied with him being a murderer. He was an immigrant. A man. He fit everyone's perception of what an axe or hatchet-wielding murderer should look like. It's nativism at its worst. And around the time he was arrested, Lizzie's murder trial began. So again, kind of cementing the idea, this is what an axe murderer looks like, not this, which worked out in Lizzie's favor. Long story short and simplified, because I honestly don't want to recount all the court drama here, Lizzie was acquitted. Her position in society, the fact that she was a woman, the jurors being mostly white Protestant men who couldn't see her as someone capable of wielding a hatchet, nativism, there were a lot of factors at play here. And it came down to the fact that society didn't believe a woman could be capable of this crime, that a daughter couldn't be capable of killing her father and stepmother. But she was capable. And after the trial, she was free. She was shunned by her church community, stared at on the street, people talked about her behind her back all the time, she was often subjected to children's pranks, but she lived a relatively free life until she died from pneumonia in 1927. It's a story that perfectly encapsulates the Gilded Age, that period of time in US history where we see rapid economic growth as a result of industrialization, but before the age of progressivism that tackled things like corruption and inequality. In the Gilded Age, those who took advantage of the economic growth, like the Borden family, grew powerful and rich. But despite that, under a thin, golden surface of a booming economy and strong industrial sectors, there was still rampant discrimination, nativism, and a general fear of immigrants, xenophobia, right? It's part of the reason why Lizzie Borden was acquitted for her crimes. She was part of the social elite, though not elite enough for her tastes, and was let off because of her gender, her status, and the overall public idea that a woman could not be capable of committing such horrific acts. Today, I think that trial would have gone down differently. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Lizzie Borden hatchet murders. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things and join as a cannibal, an explorer, or a historian. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.